Please be seated. The court is now back in session. And again, we give the floor to the prosecution to continue the rebuttal statement. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll use my last 5 minutes before I turn the floor over to my colleague to address just a couple of issues that was raised by our friend Sonaroon in his arguments about Nuon Chea. We heard an argument that there are only 25 confessions with annotations indicating they were sent to Nuon Chea, and that this represents a small percentage of the total number of S-21 confessions. Your Honors, I simply will remind you here that when the defense referred to a total of over 4,000 confessions, that number represents unannotated original confessions that were recovered at S-21. There was a relatively small number of confessions that were located outside S-21 that contain annotations. So the statistical analysis that the defense have relied on here is a distortion. The truth is that Nuon Chea received many confessions from S-21. I will not play the video clip again. You've heard it a number of times now. I'll simply remind you of Nuon Chea's own words when he was asked by Tet Sambat about his receipt and use of confessions. He said, in Nuon Chea's words, quote, "I didn't read all the documents because there were so many." Your Honors, you should also keep in mind the reason why this evidence is relevant to your judgment in this case. The defense is correct that for purposes of this judgment, you need not decide whether Nuon Chea assumed complete responsibility for S-21. The relevant issue that is before you is simply whether Nuon Chea participated in or contributed to the CPK plan to smash enemies of the party. And in that respect, Your Honors, whether he received one S-21 confession, 25 confessions, or 200 confessions, that evidence proves his knowledge of S-21. It proves his involvement in the JCE through which enemies were identified and killed. And last, Your Honors, the defense suggested that there is nothing in Nuon Chea's interviews with Tet Sambat in which he acknowledged his responsibility for S-21. I would simply refer you to Chapter 7 of that book, a chapter titled Enemies, which is full of statements attributed to Nuon Chea, proving his involvement in S-21, his relationship with Deutsch, and his knowledge of an agreement with extrajudicial killings of enemies. Let me give you one example and show you on the screen. Sonaroon challenged us. He said, if Nuon Chea had admitted this to Tet Sambat, wouldn't Tet Sambat have said so in his book? Here's what Tet Sambat said. Quote, Nuon Chea doesn't apologize for S-21, even though his niece and others close to him were sent there. He often stated that the enemies responsible for killing people in the countryside had to be smashed. Others were conspiring to overthrow Pol Pot and had to be stopped. But for every person they killed, they found out through the traitors' confessions obtained at S-21 that there were more enemies. The arms and legs of the traitors were everywhere. And continuing, for the first half of the Khmer Rouge rule, Nuon Chea didn't have direct control over S-21, but as one of the top leaders of the movement, he was involved in decisions to purge top cadre. And when Khmer Rouge Defense Minister Son Sen was dispatched to the border in the fall of 1977, Noon Chea became the de facto head of the interrogation center, according to Brother Number 2 and testimony from Deutsch. Your Honors, I simply ask you to look at all the evidence together. We've been through the evidence many times in this trial, the evidence of Noon Chea's involvement. It is our submission that it is clear beyond a reasonable doubt that Noon Chea was at the very heart of the CPK criminal plan to smash persons who were identified as enemies of the party. I thank you for your time today, and I will pass the floor to my colleague who will talk to you about Khieu Samphan.
Good afternoon, Your Honours. Good afternoon, Council, members of the public and civil parties. As my colleague just indicated, I will be addressing you on the evidence pertaining to the criminal responsibility of Khieu Samphan, as well as his role in the CPK and DK. I will note briefly before I start one procedural issue that arises for consideration. My friend has just made submissions in relation to the scope of the trial, which of course, as Your Honours have indicated on numerous occasions, includes the roles of the accused in the entire regime as well as the policies of the regime. If I can add to my colleague's submissions, there are two further reasons why evidence relating to the functioning of the regime and its policies is directly relevant to this case. My learned friend, Mr. Verken, took us in some detail through a list of paragraphs relevant to this trial. One section that he may have omitted was that dealing with paragraphs in which allegations of the widespread and systematic attack are set out. Those paragraphs are paragraphs 1350 to 1372. They speak for themselves. They set out clearly that of relevance in this trial is a widespread and systematic attack against the population of Cambodia, the regime's policies, as well as the roles of the accused in the regime. There is nothing unusual about evidence of a widespread and systematic attack going well beyond issues pertaining to the responsibility of an accused. This, in fact, is a common feature of cases involving crimes against humanity, and I will refer by name only to a few cases where this is clearly set out. A recent judgment, or relatively recent, of the ICTY in the case of Lukic, 20th of July 2009, at paragraphs 890 to 894, deals with contextual elements of widespread and systematic attack, and it makes detailed findings on matters going well beyond the specific crimes with which the accused is charged. Blagojevic, equally an ICTY trial chamber judgment, paragraph 551. ICTY Gakumbitsi, an appeals chamber judgment in July 2006 at paragraph 102. And one could go on. Certainly it is a common feature of these cases that contextual elements have to be proved and that they go beyond, well beyond, the specific events with which the accused are charged. There is a further reason why it is relevant for Your Honours to consider evidence of the contributions of the accused to the regime and to what we have called the slave state that they set up. By their very definition, forced transfers are continuing crimes. You heard from our learned friend's counsel for Mr. Khieu Samphan that there were a series of justifications or purported justifications for the forced evacuation of Phnom Penh, as well as the subsequent forced transfers. Under international law, in order to establish that a transfer is lawful, the defence must show that as soon as the reasons for the transfer cease to exist, that the population is permitted to return. Therefore, it stands to reason that the actions of a regime and the actions of the accused in furthering and managing that regime and preventing evacuees from returning to their homes are directly relevant to the crime of forced transfer. Relevant authorities on that issue are Stuckich, Appeals Chamber of the ICTY at paragraph 284, Kirstich, Trial Chamber, ICTY at paragraph 524, and Krajishnik, Appeals Chamber of the ICTY at paragraph 725. I'll move on now from issues of procedure and scope to deal with Khieu Samphan's criminal responsibility and his role in this vast joint criminal enterprise. We've heard quite a few what I would describe as far-fetched submissions over the last few days from the defence, and in particular from my learned friends for Khieu Samphan. But perhaps the most far-fetched of all was the submission that not only was Khieu Samphan not a leader, not only was he not involved in the crimes or the joint criminal enterprise, but he didn't even qualify to be a person in the leadership of the party. And why did he not qualify? Because he was an intellectual. My colleague Nick Kumjian has already referred to this point and illustrated its complete lack of a logical basis. But if I can take that one step further, was Khieu Samphan the only intellectual in the leadership of the CPK? No. Who were the other highly educated leaders? Son Sen, Ying Suri, Nuon Chia, Koi Tun, and the list goes on. Several leaders of the Standing and Central Committee, highly educated individuals. Khieu Samphan, in that sense, is not unique. What were his contributions to the establishment and furtherance of the joint criminal enterprise in the pre-75 period? Well, we know that he has admitted that he made an indispensable contribution to the very creation of the FUNC and GRUNC, the coalition which fought the war against the Khmer Republic. An extremely important political coalition which enabled the Khmer Rouge to recruit thousands upon thousands of young Cambodians to fight for the CPK and die in their cause. Khieu Samphan was the highest ranking communist in the FUNC and GRUNC. He admitted in his OCRJ statement E3/27 that he was indeed the only one who could have established that coalition with the Prince. In his submission, my learned friend Verken posed the question: when was it that Khieu Samphan accepted the use of violence, if he did, as we allege? Well, Khieu Samphan has himself provided an answer to that question. In the video which we have played a number of times in this trial, a video entitled Facing Genocide, Khieu Samphan and Pol Pot, document E3/4201, at 16 minutes 35 seconds and onward, Khieu Samphan explains that he joined the Khmer Rouge because they shared the same goals. But according to the Khmer Rouge, those goals could only be obtained through violence. And then he goes on to pose a question and answer it. Quote, "When did I accept the use of violence to change the society?" Answer, "It was when USA used Lon Nol to occupy our country." He accepted the use of violence by his own admission in 1970, and he proceeded to further, to lead, and to encourage an enterprise which was, we allege, at its core criminal, because it involved executions of innocent people, it involved enslavement, it involved forced transfers well before the Khmer Rouge took control of Phnom Penh. Evidence of Khieu Samphan's support for that violence? E3/116, a statement he issued in September 1972, 3 years almost before the fall of Phnom Penh. He calls on the population of the city to eliminate the main traders, including Lon Nol, Serik Matak, etc., and others and their subordinates. There you have it. 1972, Khieu Samphan calling for elimination of civilians and their subordinates. January 1973, a statement we've referred to a number of times in this trial, E3/637. Khieu Samphan celebrates in clear terms the destruction of 10 strategic villages. Are we to believe that people that lived in those villages were exclusively Khmer Republic soldiers with whom the CPK were engaged in an armed conflict? Of course not. In the same statement, he celebrates the smashing of 10,245 enemy heads. In his testimony, witness Meas Woon, who fought on one of the battlefields which Khieu Samphan discussed in that statement, confirmed the accuracy of the information, thereby showing that Khieu Samphan was in receipt of reports from the battlefield and that he used that information to issue public calls for violence, to issue public calls and encouragement, as well as endorsement, for killings. When the city of Wudong fell in March 1974, he said in E3/167, quote, "On 18 March, our People's National Liberation Armed Forces liberated another city, Wudong, by annihilating all the puppet soldiers there, along with their reinforcements. In other words, over 5,000 enemies were eliminated, 1,500 of whom were captured." This event happened in 1974. You have evidence before you that in that period, the Khmer Rouge, without exception, executed, captured soldiers. And of course, that is what happened at Wudong. Khieu Samphan uses his high office, the highest office held by any communist in the Funk and Grunk coalition, to endorse these killings. I will now move on to deal with the participation of Khieu Samphan in the first forced transfer, or the evacuation, or the forced evacuation of Phnom Penh. And I will respond to some of my learned friends' submissions. But I will also refer the court to our written brief, which deals with the evidence against Khieu Samphan in detail. My learned friend Gisay argued that the evidence in relation to the meeting at B5, which Khieu Samphan attended with Nguyen Chia, is not very credible. We strongly disagree. This evidence comes from a witness who, in our submission, was consistent, who showed clear memory, and who was found not only by us, but also by Philip Short as highly credible. Of course, I'm discussing Pierpont. What is some of the evidence he gave? Or rather, let me address it this way. What are the submissions by the defence on the weaknesses in his evidence with respect to the meeting at B5? They say, well, the meeting didn't discuss any details. There were no details discussed at the meeting, and therefore, even if Khieu Samphan was present, even if he was there, and even if he agreed to the evacuation, well, it wasn't significant because they didn't discuss any implementation. Pierpont's evidence on the 26th of July 2012 and 31st of July 2012 discusses the details, a blackboard, a definition of spearheads by Pol Pot in the presence of Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, the issuance of instructions to various divisions as to which spearhead they were to attack. Each zone and division were given specific instructions. The very definition of the planning of an unlawful act. The next submission they made was that it is implausible, as Pierpont suggests, that there were so many commanders present, because why would they have everybody in the same place? Wouldn't that have exposed them to danger? Well, unfortunately for my learned friends, their own client has admitted otherwise. In E3/27, his OCIJ statement, he confirms he was at Pol Pot's headquarters west of Udong. He confirms he was, in his words, briefed by Pol Pot once in a while. And he confirms that other commanders, or rather commanders who commanded the battle to overthrow Phnom Penh, were also there. Tamok, Khoi Tun, Kapok, Son Sen, and Sao Pim from time to time. Interestingly, our friends, Counsel for Nuon Chea, make the same concession at paragraph 417 of their brief, confirming that the meeting at B5 indeed discussed the liberation, as they call it, and subsequent evacuation of Phnom Penh, and that it was attended by these commanders. Is that the only evidence of Khieu Samphan's contribution to the forced evacuation of Phnom Penh? Of course not. The defence were at great pains to attack and impeach the evidence of witness Nu Mao. What was Nu Mao's evidence? This man, a commune-level cadre, attended meetings in 1974 at which he learned of certain disagreements within the party leadership as to the plan to evacuate. He described for you in detail how Tamok said that every zone would be evacuated and indeed threatened people who disagreed. He also discussed another session taught by Hu Yun, who opposed the evacuations. That evidence comes from a statement he gave Ben Kiernan on the 26th of August 1981, not long after the events. And a confirmation of the authenticity of that document is given in D269/4, a correspondence from Ben Kiernan. What is Nu Mao's evidence? He confirmed in his testimony on the 19th of June of this year that he knew at that time that Khieu Samphan was in favour of evacuating the people and that Hu Yun did not agree. He confirmed that twice when questioned by us. Asked where it was that he learnt that information, he gave a specific location, consistent with his 1981 statement. Under cross-examination, our learned friends went to great length to try and confuse Nu Mao, who, as was obvious to everyone, is an elderly man who was quite frail and struggling to keep up with the proceedings. They insisted on using the word position. What was the position of Khieu Samphan? against his evidence where he had struggled to, or where he had confirmed that he did not know Khieu Samphan's position. On the 20th of June, at 14:10:52, he is asked the question as to whether or not he knew Khieu Samphan's position on the evacuations. His response, "No, I did not know his position," full stop. Couple of lines below, "As for Mr. Khieu Samphan and Mr. Hu Nim, I did not know them." No mention of the word evacuation. In our submission, clearly Mr. Nu Mao was discussing his knowledge, or lack thereof, of the positions of Khieu Samphan and Hu Nim. Is that the only evidence of Khieu Samphan's support for the evacuation? No, there is more. Phir Phun, on the 26th of July 2012, not in relation to B5, but in relation to political indoctrination sessions in the months following the fall of Udong. Pol Pot, Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan teaching their subordinates as to the good experiences from Udong and how those experiences will be implemented once Phnom Penh is taken. The evidence of Nu Mao and of Phir Phun is of course consistent with other accounts. The defence's favourite witness, Francois Ponchot, testified on the 9th of April 2013 that the practice of evacuating the cities was so broad that everybody knew that this is what the Khmer Rouge did. And he said at 13:44:46, people were evacuated, heads of groups were killed. This thing is not new. That happened already since 1973. In her submissions, Madam Chia Liang referred, Your Honours, to two witnesses interviewed by Steve Hedder in E3/1714, both of whom confirm a pre-existing policy to evacuate cities, and one of whom specifically said, if we had captured Phnom Penh in 1974, we would have also evacuated it then. To all of this evidence, what does Khieu Samphan say? In his interview with OCIJ in E3/210, he says that he didn't know. He had no idea that there was a plan to evacuate Phnom Penh. In our respectful submission, a clearly disingenuous and dishonest statement. A statement that Khieu Samphan has elected not to have tested before Your Honours. It is therefore not entitled to probative value. But he said another thing in that interview. He said, I clearly realised that the population might have fallen along the way. In his own words, he realised that people were going to fall. In other words, people were going to die. When did that happen? In his version of the events, on the 17th of April, when he overheard a conversation between soldiers. What did he do in response to that information, in response to a realisation that people would fall and die? We've referred to this statement a number of times, but I will summarise it again. E3/118, Khieu Samphan's first opportunity to address the people of Cambodia, to address the millions who had been evacuated and dispossessed. And these are his words, quote, "This is our nation's and people's greatest victory." And he celebrates how they smashed all enemy manoeuvres, how they relentlessly attacked, how they drained the enemy of all his strength, including food and rice, and how finally, quote, "the enemy died in agony." Those are the words of Khieu Samphan on the 22nd of April, 1975. He was in Phnom Penh. He saw an empty city. he saw a ghost city emptied of the millions of its inhabitants. His response, our nation's and people's greatest historic victory. But there is even more evidence of Khieu Samphan's intent to participate and actual participation in the decision to evacuate. My learned friend Gise referred to an interview given in 1982. This is E3/687, a New York Times interview, 9th of July 1982, in which Khieu Samphan admits unequivocally and without reservation that the evacuation of the cities was a collective decision, a decision in which he participated. Does he deny giving that interview? No. Does he deny saying those words? No. What do they say to explain this clear admission? Well, he was a politician and he was making a political statement, and it was important to show loyalty. Do not be misled by this statement, Your Honours. This is an admission, and as such, it should be treated. Is that all? No. E152.1.52, a recent interview, a video interview, where he affirms that had a single voice been raised against the evacuations, there would have been no evacuations. Entirely consistent with his 1982 admission that this was indeed a collective, unanimous decision. My colleague Rainer referred also to a justification he gave recently, which is remarkably consistent to justifications given by Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia, and very different from that which you have been hearing from his lawyers in this courtroom. If I can move on to Khieu Samphan's positions and roles in the Ministry of Commerce, and I will try and move on through this quickly, even though the material is voluminous. Why is it relevant? It is relevant because by supervising this ministry and state warehouses, he was contributing to a joint criminal enterprise to forcibly move people into forced labour camps, to enslave them and to subject them to inhumane conditions of life in order to extract produce, which Khieu Samphan and his colleagues then withdrew and kept in warehouses in Phnom Penh. You saw in my colleague Bill Smith's submissions evidence of Khieu Samphan's receipt of vast amounts of produce from various zones in E3/3511, including millions of kilograms of rice withdrawn from the northwest zone. Role in commerce. They say, well, he was only a technical assistant. No real role, no real authority. They could not be further from the truth. This man was indeed the party centre's man when it came to running the slave state on a day-to-day basis. Within that collective leadership, he was in charge of withdrawing produce from the cooperatives, from the slave camps, and using it as he and his colleagues determined to be appropriate. They say he wasn't in charge, it was Khoi Thun. Because Khoi Thun was appointed in October and then in March 76 to deal with matters of commerce. Your Honours, what happened to Khoi Thun? He was put under house arrest in April 76, 1 month after being appointed to the same committee with Khieu Samphan to deal with purchases from China. Where was Khoi Thun kept under house arrest? Your Honours heard evidence from his former messenger, Pean Kien, on the 2nd of May and the 3rd of May 2012, explaining that Khoi Thun was indeed held under house arrest some 300 metres from K1, a location at which Khieu Samphan, Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia and the other leaders worked on a continuous basis. The next set of submissions that I wish to address was the defence's attempt to impeach the evidence of witness Sakim Ulmut. By way of a very quick summary, Sakim Ulmut testified that Q Sampan and Vaughan Vet were indeed the upper echelon when it came to the Ministry of Commerce, that they supervised that ministry, that they had power to direct that ministry, that the ministry had no power to do anything without their approval. Of course, they found this quite inconvenient. So in their submissions, they say, well, he was presented with documents. He was forced to say this. He was confused, or he was making speculations. Again, false. The documents I showed him when he gave that evidence, E3/1613 and E3/1614, are minutes of meetings that Sakim Ulmut himself attended. He was indeed reluctant to go into great detail on his own role during the Khmer Rouge period. But the evidence shows that he was indeed very much connected to the Ministry of Commerce and understood the matters on which he was giving evidence. Before I address that evidence, how did Sakim Ulmut respond when the defence accused him that he was just speculating? 5th of June 2012, in response to my learned friend Kong Samon's questioning, he says, I was not just making an assumption without any basis. I was basing that conclusion or assumption on the documents. And clearly, according to the documents, it is very likely that Hem was above the Commerce Committee. That was at 10:52 on the 5th of June. Then my learned friend Kong Samon asks the same question again, coming from a different angle, at 10:14:29. Sakim Ulmut again confirms, I am not just making assumptions. And who was Sakim Ulmut? Well, he testified before Your Honours that he was Deputy Director of the Foreign Trade Bank of Cambodia. What was his proximity to Q Sampan and the Ministry of Commerce? You have on the case file 9 sets of meeting minutes with foreign delegations attended by Sakim Ulmut. This man was intimately familiar with the matters he was discussing. 7 of the meetings he attended were indeed reported to Q Sampan. In a further meeting, he was in fact the most senior representative from the Cambodian side, and that is in E3/1642. When I asked him about that document on the 4th of June 2012, he did not deny that he attended the meeting, and he did not disagree with me that he was the most senior person. He also received ledgers indicating the expenditure of money to purchase items from China, and one such document is at E3/336. It contains annotations referring to both Q Sampan and Sakim Ulmut. What did Sakim Ulmut do after 1979? He was a minister in the Democratic Kampuchea government presided over by Q Sampan. E3/1435. A man obviously considered competent enough, senior enough, knowledgeable enough to be Secretary of State for Supply and Transportation in the government of Democratic Kampuchea that Q Sampan led within months of the fall of Khmer Rouge. Is Sakim Ulmut's evidence out of context? Are the defence right when they say, well, it wasn't Q Sampan, it was Vaughan Vet who was really in charge? On the case file, there are more than 20 reports from the Ministry of Commerce to the upper echelon. How many of those reports are addressed to Vaughan Vet? 0. How many of those reports were addressed to Khieu Samphan? All of them. But they say, but Khieu Samphan was not Angkar. When they talk about Angkar in these documents, you should interpret that to mean somebody else, not Khieu Samphan. Really? In the documents addressed to Khieu Samphan, in those 20-plus documents, numerous references to Angkar indicating clearly that the Ministry of Commerce was communicating to Khieu Samphan as a representative of Angkar who would provide further instructions. And you will find that, Your Honours, in E3/2041, a report addressed to Angkar, which states, quote, a report addressed to Khieu Samphan, which states, and I quote, request Angkar to form opinion in order to inform them of this matter. Similarly, E3/2042, E3/304. And all of these reports, Your Honours, indicate clearly that the Ministry is reporting to their superior, seeking his instructions and asking for his approval or guidance. Two documents of particular interest, E3/1637, a report of the 12th of November 1978 on negotiations with Yugoslavia, again addressed to Hem, or rather contains an annotation already sent to Brother Hem. It says, I would like you, brother, to be informed of this report and give your comments as guidance. Well, you might say, well, that doesn't prove anything about Angkar. Let's look at another document. E3/1638 states, it refers back to the document I just mentioned, saying report was made to Angkar. It confirms that the report of the 12th of November, which was submitted to Khieu Samphan, was in the words of the Commerce Committee submitted to Angkar. And who was Angkar? Judge Cartwright asked that question of Professor Chandler on the 18th of July 2012. He testified that that was the collective, the leadership, the group mentioned in the standing committee in committee minutes that he was looking at, including Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Khieu Samphan, Ieng Sary, and other leaders. He confirmed that same conclusion when cross-examined by the defence on the 24th of July 2012, and he did so in several instances. Well, they might say, well, Professor Chandler is merely speculating. Angkar was clearly a reference to Pol Pot, not a reference to the collective leadership. E3/740, an instruction, a directive from Committee 870 on the use of the term Angkar. It criticises cadre for using the term to refer to individuals and says, and I quote, the term Angkar or party is used only for the organisation. It shall not be used for any individuals. So when the Ministry of Commerce addresses Angkar, they are addressing the collective leaders, and they are addressing them through their immediate superior, Khieu Samphan. That much is proven beyond any reasonable doubt on the documents before Your Honours. I will not go in great detail on the evidence of Khieu Samphan's participation in the party centre. It's discussed in detail in our written brief. By way of a summary, he attended 86% of the Standing Committee meetings for which minutes survive. He has admitted that he lived and worked with Nguyen Chia and other leaders, including Pol Pot, that he took part in self-criticism sessions with them, that they did nothing separately, they ate together, they did self-criticism together. He is the third most frequent attendee at Standing Committee meetings. Only Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia attended more often than Khieu Samphan. Several full rights members of the Standing Committee attended less frequently. The implications of that evidence? That he was very much in the heart of power, that he was, with those leaders in Phnom Penh, in charge, that they were a collective decision-making body, that they devised their policies and had them implemented together. Other facts of his authority, of his actual executive authority, and his ability to contribute to this regime and this joint criminal enterprise. Evidence of witness Mea Sworn. I will not discuss it in detail. On the 4th of October 2012, you will recall, Your Honours, this witness describing how he, as the newly appointed Secretary of Sector 103, was instructed by Khieu Samphan to report to him on all matters in the sector, including the circumstances of Khieu Samphan's wife's relatives. What happened following that telegram? Mea Sworn and his boss, the new Secretary of the North Zone, investigated the circumstances of Khieu Samphan's relatives. They found one of them to be imprisoned in the Siem Reap prison with 700 prisoners. The Secretary of the new North Zone personally goes to the prison and arranges the release of Khieu Samphan's relative. Now, the defence insists that there's some problem with this evidence because the report back to Khieu Samphan may or may not have been received. We say that is completely beside the point. What the episode demonstrates is that Khieu Samphan, either personally or through his membership of the party centre, was able to direct a zone secretary to investigate the whereabouts of his relatives. And he was able to have his relative released from a prison in which 700 prisoners were left. You also heard evidence of a meeting on the 5th and 6th of January 1979 where Khieu Samphan presided in Phnom Penh. 100 or more people attending, all of them in leadership positions. The subject of the meeting, the Vietnamese invasion. My friend Gissé takes issue, or rather says, that the fact that he was discussing enemies, well, that's normal. Enemies are invading. We don't take issue with that. But what enemies was he discussing? Evidence of witness Ruh Soy, their own witness. On the 25th of April 2013, he confirms his prior statement that Khieu Samphan said that the problems with the Vietnamese were caused by enemies burrowing from within. A phrase Your Honours and this court is well familiar with. A code word for internal enemies, a code word for those to be purged. Another import of that meeting is that he was presiding over a meeting involving at least 100 senior cadre. Again, evidence of his authority, power and influence. They take issue, next, with evidence of Khieu Samphan's role in political indoctrination. And I'm not surprised. This is very damning evidence of Khieu Samphan's endorsement of the JCE policies, his furtherance of the policies, his contributions to their implementation. They take issue with the evidence of Ek Hen. The only inconsistency, or alleged inconsistency in her evidence, was the year in which Khieu Samphan taught. Khieu Samphan said in that session, according to Ek Hen, that Pang, a senior cadre in Office 870, had been arrested as a traitor collaborating with the Vietnamese. What is clear from her evidence is that she was not confused, though the defence for Khieu Samphan may have been. In the full transcript of her OCRJ interview, D94/8.1, she makes it clear that there were two sessions, one in 76 or 77 and one in 78, and that the second one was taught by Khieu Samphan. That establishes that the time when Khieu Samphan gave that presentation was relevant and consistent indeed with him confirming Pang's arrest. We, of course, have evidence confirming Pang's arrest in early 1978. She confirms that in her OCIJ, the full transcript of her interview. She confirmed that in court when cross-examined by my learned friend, Mr. Verkin. And she did so twice. In the transcript of the 3rd of July 2013, on 2 separate occasions, she confirmed that it was Khieu Samphan that gave that lesson, that it was in 1978, that it was the second and not the first session, and that the first session had indeed been taught by Nuon Chea. Other witnesses who confirm Khieu Samphan's participation by way of encouragement, endorsement of the criminal policies. Moon, a civil party whose evidence they also sought to impeach. He talked about how Khieu Samphan encouraged cadre to look for those who pretended to be sick, particularly to look for infiltrated enemies, to watch new people in particular because they were steeped in feudalism. His evidence was uncertain on only one point, and that is the date of this event. He was at pains on the 28th of August and on the 29th of August to explain or to affirm for the court that he was telling the truth. And he specifically acknowledged, I may not remember the date, but I remember the event. And so his evidence stands. Other witnesses who gave similar evidence of Khieu Samphan's political indoctrination, Pirpun, Ban Kien, and even witnesses interviewed by Philip Short, one of whom discussed Khieu Samphan's justification for the evacuation of the cities. Just as he had contributed to the forced evacuation of Phnom Penh and the criminal policies that underpinned that event, as well as the second forced transfer and the killings of Khmer Republic officials and soldiers, he supported the enemy policy more broadly. Of course, you have heard now on numerous occasions uncontradicted evidence that he issued the decision to kill the 7 traitors. He sat in a meeting on the 8th of March 1976, E3/232, in which arrests were discussed. He was a member of the Central Committee at a time when the infamous decision on the right to smash enemies was issued. He confirmed to Steve Hedder in 1980 that all of those who were arrested were guilty. In other words, they got what they deserved. In his speeches in 1976, 77 and 78, using the highest officers in the land, he endorsed CPK's policy to search for and eliminate its enemies. That evidence is on the case file, and I don't propose to rehearse it. He also played his part in denying Democratic Kampuchea atrocities, another contribution to this criminal plan. In his interview in August 1975, found in E3/119, he discussed the criticism of the Democratic Kampuchea regime as propaganda designed to discredit and slander us. He said this propaganda was nothing but an irritating and meaningless noise. And he did this on many occasions, Your Honours. An apologist and a defender of the CPK and its criminal policies. He did so after the period as well, as you well know from his 1987 book, E3/703, in which, while acknowledging mass arrests, he said, "We killed less people than died in car accidents in other countries." All of this evidence, Your Honours, shows a continuing, unreserved, active and committed participation by this accused in the joint criminal enterprise which led to the crimes with which he is now charged. He was a member of the Centre. He was one of the most trusted people working closely with Pol Pot and Nuon Chea. You must not believe his assertions that he did not know, that he did not participate. The evidence exposes them as nothing but bare lies. And if I can say a few words in conclusion, Your Honours, on behalf of the Office of the Co-Prosecutors, at the end of what has been a long and complex trial. I wish to go back to the 17th of April, 1975. This was a day which could have been a day of reconciliation. It could have been a day of hope. It could have marked the end of the suffering of the Cambodian people. The Khmer Rouge prevailed in the war. Their adversary surrendered. General Mesa Chan, in his broadcast on the 17th of April, invited them into the cities and said, "The doors are open to you," calling them his blood brothers, seeking to reach out in a spirit of reconciliation, committing himself and his troops to maintaining order so that the Khmer Rouge can take power. But in their hearts, Your Honours, there was no room for reconciliation. There was no room for compassion. Any leader who wanted reconciliation on the 17th of April, any leader who was not intent on committing mass crimes, would have permitted people to live in freedom. They would have allowed people to live with their families and in their homes. They would not have dispossessed them. They would not have forced them out of their homes and into an enslavement that was to last for almost 4 years. Instead of accepting the offer of reconciliation, they set out to destroy an entire way of life and to turn a country into a suffering nation of slaves. The plan, steeped in criminality, based in the use of violence, brutality, enslavement, murder of all those who opposed or who resisted. People were out of the city, but that was not the end. They were to write biographies because searches were to continue for the enemies. These accused appointed themselves the masters of every life in this country. They took it upon themselves to decide who lived and who died. They brought this country to its knees. They caused the death of almost a quarter of its population. Let's not forget, Your Honours, that they institutionalised extrajudicial killings. From the highest officers in this land, an order went delegating authority at every level to smash those inside and outside the ranks. An order criminal in every sense of that word. These accused and the organisation they led were masters of deception, and hence the use of the word Ankar, hence the use of the codes 870, hence the veil of secrecy and the rules which they imposed and implemented. But we submit, Your Honours, that that veil has been lifted. It has been lifted by evidence before you. What that evidence shows is that they ran the slave state through a highly organised, centralised hierarchy. They issued directives and received reports, as you have seen time and time again. They kept themselves informed of the crimes, and they ensured that the crimes continued to be committed. Khieu Samphan and Nguyen Chia are guilty of the crimes with which they are charged because they were at the heart of this joint criminal enterprise, because every crime committed was committed in furtherance of the policies they adopted. They are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and the sentence they deserve is a sentence of life imprisonment. Nothing less can ever match or even come close to matching the gravity of the crimes that they are guilty of. We ask Your Honours to judge them fairly, and we ask you to find them guilty and we ask you to sentence them to life imprisonment. Those are our submissions, and unless we can assist Your Honours further, the prosecution will rest.
President, thank you, the prosecution. The time is now appropriate for today's adjournment, and before the chamber adjourned, we would like to inform the parties to the proceeding and the public that for tomorrow's proceeding, the two accused and their respective defense teams will be allowed the floor to make their final statement. And in order to properly manage tomorrow's proceeding, the chamber would like to inquire from the defense teams and the two accused that during the closing and final statement tomorrow, who will speak first, either the accused or the defense team, and how much time does each team need, that is in relation to the 2-hour time allocation as set forth by the chamber. And in the case of Nguyen Chi, if he wishes to speak tomorrow, where will he speak? Will he speak from the holding cell downstairs, or will he come to the courtroom to make his speech? As for Khieu Samphan's defense and Khieu Samphan himself, during tomorrow's proceeding, if the rebuttal statement made by Nguyen Chi and Nguyen Chi's defense concludes within the time allocation, and if the time is available, the chamber will give the floor to Khieu Samphan or his defense team to make their final statement. So we would like now to give the floor to Counsel Victor Coupe to enlighten the court on the arrangement within your team and your client.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is the intention of our client to speak tomorrow approximately 1 hour and a half. That is at least what he thinks it will amount to. Obviously, he's not quite sure if he will stay within the 1 hour and a half, but that is what he is now anticipating. He would also like to give his statement here in the courtroom, not in his holding cell. The problem is, however, that we and also he do not feel he will be able to speak for 1 hour and a half straight in a row. So we think that it would be wise to have a pause in the middle of his 90-minute speech. That is to be said about our client. What I would like to ask the chamber is, we know that we have in total the amount of 2 hours to speak, that notwithstanding the exact amount of time that Nguyen Chi will speak, we will be able, or I will be able to reply to the submissions of today for the period of half hour. So technically or theoretically we could speak a little longer than 2 hours, but that is then due to the fact that our client doesn't know exactly how long he will speak.
Thank you, Victor Coupe. And yes, the International Council for Khieu Samphan, you may proceed.
We wouldn't need more than 1 hour. We may need less, such that we would propose that our learned colleague of the non-chair team should use the rest of our time. As for the order in which we will speak, the lawyers will take the floor first, followed by Mr. Kyosampan.
President, thank you, Council. And thank you, everyone. The Chamber will adjourn now and will resume tomorrow morning, that is Thursday, the 31st of October 2013, commencing from 9 a.m. And as we just informed the parties to the proceeding and the public, tomorrow the floor will be given to the co-accused and the defense teams to make their final rebuttal statement. This information is also applicable to the support staff, and we invite all the general public to attend the proceeding on time. Security guards started to take the two accused, Kyosampan and Nuon Chea, to the ECC detention facility and have them return to the courtroom personally tomorrow morning prior to 9 a.m. The court is now adjourned.